Hi folks, my name is Adam and I like to make tiny nerdy things. And today I wanted to make an island, so I made Outset Island from the Legend of Zelda. So the first thing we'll need is a map and a whole bunch of chunks of leftover foam. The thickness I'm working on is a 15mm, and I figure if I stack them up enough, I should get a pretty decent height out of 5 or 6 pieces. So I found the map on the World Wide Web's Wind Waker wiki, and then using the map as a template, I can cut out the general shape of the islands. It doesn't matter too much if they don't line up perfectly, since I've made them all a little oversized to facilitate the choppy in the next step anyways. Shaving everything down was a bit trickier since there aren't really any good resources for the island as a model, but after piecing together enough photos, I was able to get a pretty accurate shape for both of the islands. It's been a hot minute since I played Wind Waker, so I gave up trying to shape things from memory almost immediately. Fortunately, there are a lot of Minecraft builds, oddly enough, so they give you a general shape and an idea as to where everything's supposed to line up in terms of size and spacing. It also means that if you see a couple parts on this that are a bit more cuboid than they ought to be, at least you know why now. So once I've got the general shape I'm after and I'm relatively content with how they look, I can start adding some texture paste in. This stuff is really great for hiding the seams that are really obvious between the pieces of foam, and if you use a proper glue made for foam, these seams are a lot less noticeable, but given that I'm kind of a dum-dum, I used hot glue instead. It's fast, but it leaves big old gaps everywhere that need to be filled. So the last step is going to be shaving down some of the rocks and giving it a bit more of a stony texture, which I'll just use the knife to scratch and cut and rip and tear. And then I'll go over the entire thing with black Mod Podge. If you've watched any crafting videos on YouTube, you probably see black Mod Podge used a lot. It's basically just black paint and Mod Podge mixed together so that you get sort of a nice undercoat. It protects the foam, and it also acts as a pretty decent primer. So after I'd spent all that time cutting and shaping these things, I realized that I now wanted them to be submerged in resin. That means that they're too low, and I need to add another layer of foam on the bottom just to lift them up. So it's just a case of gluing on a piece of foam and then blending it in. Then we're ready to paint the entire thing gray. So this is just a basic stone gray, and then I'll come back through for some highlights with a slightly blue tinted gray, which I'll just kind of slather wherever I feel like it. And then once that's dried thoroughly, we're on to the dry brushing, and dry brushing is my jam. So we're gonna start with a bone white and go pretty heavy over absolutely everything. And then to highlight sort of the tips and all the edges of the rocks, a bright white, sort of downward where the sun or light would be hitting any of the corners. Then the final step will be adding in the black wash. This will get into all the little nooks and crannies, and it'll really highlight all those rocks and add shadows and depth to the entire thing. You can make a really easy wash just by thinning out some acrylic paint with some water and a tiny bit of dish soap, and that'll help it flow everywhere it needs to go. Now this was the second dumb mistake I done made, and I used some fairly thin foam for the base. If I had been thinking, I would have used something a little bit sturdier, even just a thicker piece of foam. I really don't know why in my little pea brain I thought that using a really thin piece of foam would be a good idea, but there's not much I can do to undo that, so we're here now. So I'm just attaching little pieces of rock and outcroppings that go under the bridge, and then there's the 4 little stepping stones that line between the bridges. Because they'll be stuck in the water, I wanted to add them on little pillars so that they'll be the right height. Then to give the foam a little bit of texture for when I paint it, I'm gonna blast it with the heat gun just to melt it and form tiny little undulations across the entire base. Then the painting's pretty straightforward: sand color for the sand and grass color for the grass. Now I will go back through and cover everything with flock and grout, but I want to make sure that I've got a nice base color underneath so that any of the thinner sections of flock and grout will not be quite so obvious. And the last step before adding said grout and flock will be painting on my pathways. These are going to determine where the houses go, and it'll also let me know where I'm supposed to add the flock over top. Then the real final step is going to be painting the water. So this is just blue, I think it's primary blue, to cover the entire bottom of the ocean, and then I went through with a little bit of a lighter blue and blended that in just to make it seem like the water was getting darker the further you went out from shore. I'm pretty sure that's how water works, So that's what I done did. Then I'll apply a thin layer of Mod Podge over the sand areas, and then using a little bit of this grout, which I am using for all my sand now. This stuff is just sand-colored grout. It's literally the grout that goes between your tiles, and it works so well for sand. Real sand's a bit too granular, it's a bit too big in terms of like the size of the diorama itself, so I like to use grout. Then I'll take a little isopropyl alcohol, spray the entire thing down, and then spray a little bit of that thinned out Mod Podge over the entire thing just to lock it in place. Then I'll dab up the remainder of the glue just to keep the... well, I don't know why I do it. I'm gonna go over the entire thing in flock anyway, so I'm not entirely sure why I bothered doing all that. Now we're going to start making the support beams for the bridges. So I'm just going to chop some stir sticks into smaller stir sticks, and then these will get skewered into wherever the bridge is going to be. I'm not concerned about the height yet because I'm going to pour the resin first, and then once the resin cures, I'll know what height to cut them down at. Then we're on to my favorite part, which is covering the entire diorama in naturally fermented raw kimchi. While I would have loved to apply static grass everywhere, the grass was a bit too long, so instead I'm going to use some superfine foam flock. To attach to the base, I'll carefully paint Mod Podge everywhere that's green, and then brush the fine flock off everywhere that isn't green. If you take your time when you're applying the Mod Podge, this should be a pretty easy step because, well, it's not glued down, so it's not going to be sticky. Now I want to pretend like my original design was meant to have the door to Haboons? I don't know, the fish guy, whatever the fish spirit's name is actually pronounced. Originally I wanted to have that open, but in reality I just forgot to make it. So I had to go back through and make one out of clay, which I then cured and glued in place. Then we're on to the actual ocean itself. So the entire thing is going to be made out of resin, and I want the island to basically be surrounded by a nice, clear, beautiful coat of water. Now to do that, I needed to build a four-sided frame, sort of like an aquarium, that the island will sit in, and then the resin will be poured into it. Now for anyone keeping track at home, this is the third big dumb mistake I made, which was not having enough resin. I had enough resin, but I ruined the first batch, so I ended up running out, and this stuff isn't easy to acquire, so I'm gonna have to make do with a smaller amount. It's also worth noting that when you make these little aquariums, ensure that they're waterproof. They are a tight seal all the way around. I did that, that's the one thing I did properly, and I would like that noted on my permanent record, that I actually checked multiple times to make sure that it was water sealed. It's just all the other stuff I didn't do so good. But while we wait for all that to cure, we can get started on the rest of the island. At this point, the only thing that's missing from our island is everything from our island. So to remedy that, let's get cracking on the 4 Outset Island homes. I've rolled out some of this sort of beigey clay into strips that I can layer one on top of the other so that I know I have a uniform building height. Then I'll cut the general shape of the houses, and I'm not too concerned about the details because we can paint most of it on afterwards, or we can add it in as we go. To add the wooden beam effect to the sides of the houses, I'm just going to layer on some fairly thick paint. I tried making it out of little sticks of wood, but they didn't seem to adhere to the clay at all, so it's easy enough just to paint them on. Then once I have the 4 warring houses of the Outset Islands blocked out, I'm ready to start adding the details. I'll start by squishing some thatched roof colored clay into a vaguely thatched roof shaped shape, and then I'll glue that onto the top using some bacon bond. I'll also add a bit more detail by outlining the wooden beam at the top, as well as using my sculpting tool to add some straw-shaped dealies in along the side of the roof. With the main body and the roof all sorted, I can get working on the external parts. This is Link's house, so we need to make the little porch, patio, deck dealie that will be hanging off the side of the building. So I'm just going to use a couple of stir sticks cut into smaller lengths and then super glued together. They'll get attached onto the building, and then I'll add the teeny tiny details very slowly and very carefully. It's always easier to get them a little oversized and then cut them off than try and cut them perfectly the first time. Then at this point, it's just a case of looking at the screenshots and trying to copy the various wee details. I'll do the same thing to the other houses and then paint some of the wood just to add a bit more color, but that's them basically finished. Now we're on to making the palm trees. Normally something like palm trees I would make out of paper, but I found the paper was a bit too finicky and I wanted to try something a little bit different. I noticed that this painter's tape is just about the perfect color. So I've cut out a strip and laid it sticky side up, and then I'll attach a bunch of these little floral wires, and then put another piece of tape over the top of it to seal them all in place. This means there's no sticky parts pointing out, and it is sealed on itself. Then it's as simple as running your knife down the middle to separate them, and then a little pair of scissors will cut each of these leaves out. Each of the palm fronds, are they called? Are they called palm fronds? Palm fronds?
Dime Hans. A dime fronds.
Yeah, palm fronds. So I'll cut the palm fronds shape and then cut the tiny little slivers into the side of it. And that's basically the entirety of the leaf done. So then I just need to stick 8 of them together. Why 8? I don't know, it's just the random number I chose. And then it's just a case of shaping it into something vaguely palm tree. Now this is where the genius of it comes into play. Because it is painter's tape, it's very flexible and it's not going to snap on you. And the wire inside is also really easy to bend. It's also really, really good at taking paint. Like, it'll soak up paint nicely. So all you need to do is paint the base with a brown. Now I did use just some brown Mod Podge, so it's a little bit stronger and a little bit sturdier. Then I highlighted with some sort of, we'll call this coconut beige. And then I just dry brushed the leaves to give them a little bit more color. And with that, you've got, I think, a pretty good and adorable little palm tree. You could even make little coconuts or something like that if you were so inclined. But I just made a whole bunch more, and they're ready to go on the island. Speaking of the island, let's see how it turned out. Now, in the middle of the night, I woke up and thought, you know what would be a really good idea? Using some XPS foam to displace the resin that I had poured so that it raises up to the level I wanted. And in theory, it's not necessarily a bad idea, except the foam melted and combined with the resin, which means that once I got everything snapped off, it took a lot of extra work just to get it to look decent. Now, I'm sure there's a lesson somewhere in there, but I'll be damned if I can find it. Which is fortunate because we're moving on. So the first thing will be snipping all of these beams down to the appropriate height. And then adding my waves. So the waves will be done using some Mod Podge and a straw. This is my favorite way to add waves to anything, really. So the idea is you coat everything in a nice thick layer of this Mod Podge, and then you use the aforementioned straw to blow ripples into it. Now the Mod Podge does go on white, but once it dries it will be crystal clear and very glossy, so it will make for absolutely perfect waves. Now I did forget to make the stone head statue thing, so I just made that out of clay, and then I'll get started on the dilapidated bridge that connects the two islands. Once I got the fence posts in place, I'll use a little bit of twine that I have unwound into just individual strands, then I'll tape those down and put itty-bitty, teeny-weeny planks across that before using some tweezers and a little bit of super glue to lock it all in place. Top tip here is, if you want to show people how you're doing it, put your hand in the way the whole time. Then I chopped a couple more pieces and glued those onto the side before using another strand of the twine just on the top, held in place by super glue. And this will act as sort of that handrail, and it'll give a little bit more depth. Now to finish the waves that are breaking on the shoreline, I'm going to use a little of this extra heavy gel gloss, which is basically the same idea as the gloss Mod Podge, only it's quite a bit thicker. I also got all the way through this before I realized that I still need to add those little rocks in that connect all the bridges and whatnot. So I'll do that before going through with the rest of my heavy gel medium. Now the heavy gel medium works the very same way as the Mod Podge in that it dries clear, but it holds its shape a little bit better, so it's better for making waves or water breaks or anything like that. It also takes a dry brush quite nicely, so if you want to add easy waves without having to worry about actually painting properly, it's a great option for you. So once that's dried, I'm going to take just some basic Vallejo white and stipple brush over everything. And then this will add sort of that foamy water break along the edge of all the water and anywhere that those pillars are coming out as well. Now, the astute among you will notice that I painted the pillars in the bridge. All I did was add a bit of darker brown to highlight some of the different sections, so they're not all the same stir stick beige. Turns out stir sticks are just about the perfect size for the planks that I need, but they're a little bit too bland, so I'm going to use just a sanding file to sort of cut some grooves into them to make it look like there's little planks and they're separate pieces of wood stuck together. Now when it came to making that forested section that was on top, I had considered just making a 2D cutout like you have in the game, but it felt kinda like a cop-out, so instead I opted to use about 1,000 toothpicks. So I chopped the toothpicks in half, and then just jammed them in until it was fairly well forested. I didn't even need to paint the toothpicks because they're pretty well the color I needed for this. So all I had to do was lock it in place using a little bit of thinned out Mod Podge, and we're ready to add the foliage to it. Now the foliage I'm using is Woodland Scenic's clump foliage, which happens to rank in my top 3 all-time clump foliages. All it needs is a little Mod Podge on the tips of all the toothpicks, and then you just kinda jam it into place. I'm really just gonna pile it on until I'm happy with the height, and all I wanna do is make sure that I cover all those stakes so the toothpicks are not quite so obvious. Then I'm going to cover the entire thing with a fairly healthy coating of thinned out Mod Podge. Then I add a little bit of variation in the color by adding some different flocks. So I've added some sort of yellowy turf before adding the same color that all the grass is just over top to just tie it all together. And of course it all gets locked in place with that thinned out Mod Podge again. And then we're on to adding literally everything else. I'll start with the largest stuff first so that I know it fits, before just moving my way down in size until I'm happy that everything that is supposed to be here is here. Then with that last piece in place, I'd say we're finished and on to the glamour shots. So while the island spins in the background, let me give a big shout out to my newest patrons, Christian Kung, Ninny Cole, Angel Coleman, and Helena Hinkle. And hey, did you know that you can help out as well? You don't even need to be a patron. All you need to do is smash that like button and share this video with all your friends, your family, your neighbors, your doctor, your local MP, and anyone else. And if you haven't already subscribed yet, well, now seems like a swell time to do so. If you liked the video, leave me a comment down below. I've got a real hankering for building a building, so let me know in the comments what iconic building you would like to see remade in miniature. Otherwise, we will see you next time. Cheers.